My name is Elliot Logan, and I'm 42 years old. This happened just a few months ago when I decided to camp near Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena, California. I'm an amateur historian and documentarian, and I thought I could spend a few quiet days debunking some of the wild paranormal claims about the place. What happened instead made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. It started as an idea for a YouTube series. I'd recently been laid off from my job, and with nothing but time on my hands, I figured I'd combine my love for history and film. Devil's Gate was an obvious choice for my first episode. The place had all the elements: eerie stories, a dark history of occult rituals, and unexplained disappearances, perfect for clicks, I thought. I drove my RV to a secluded spot near the Arroyo Seco. The area was quiet, too quiet. The dam loomed in the distance, a hulking concrete relic overshadowing the dry riverbed. It was an unnerving sight, but I told myself that was part of its appeal. I met a man named Ray on my second day. He was a maintenance worker, maybe 50 or so, with a face like crumpled leather and a permanent scowl. "You camping out here?" he asked, eyeing my RV like it offended him. "Yeah, just for a few days. I'm doing a project on the history of the dam." Ray snorted. "History, huh? A lot of bad stuff happened here, you know. People messing with things they shouldn't." "Like what?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. This was exactly the kind of local color I wanted for my video. Ray shook his head. "You don't want to know. Just don't hang around after dark, okay? And if you see anything strange, leave." "Strange?" I pressed, but he just muttered something under his breath and walked away. I should have taken his warning seriously. The first night I started filming near the dam, the place gave off an oppressive vibe, like it was watching me. The concrete was cracked and stained, and a low hum seemed to vibrate through the air. I dismissed it as the sound of water moving through the structure, though the reservoir was nearly empty. As I set up my camera, I heard whispers, faint like a breeze carrying fragments of a conversation. I paused, listening, but they stopped the moment I turned my head. Shaking it off, I continued filming, narrating the dam's history, how it got its name from the jagged rock formations nearby that supposedly resembled devil horns, how it became infamous for occult activity in the 1940s. I was editing footage in my RV when the whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from the dam, though I couldn't see anyone around. My camera, which had been working fine all day, suddenly refused to record. I tried rebooting it, but the screen just flickered and went black. Frustrated, I called it a night. The next morning, I found something strange near the dam. Burnt scraps of paper with cryptic symbols scrawled on them. They looked old, like they'd been sitting there for years, though they hadn't been there the day before. I took pictures and tucked the pieces into a plastic bag for later. As the day went on, I started feeling uneasy. The dam's hum, which I'd barely noticed before, seemed to grow louder, almost rhythmic. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. By evening, I was seriously questioning whether I should stay. Then I saw him. I was walking back to my RV when I spotted a tall, shadowy figure standing near the dam's edge. He was impossibly still, as though carved from darkness. I called out, thinking maybe it was Ray or another worker, but the figure didn't move. When I shone my flashlight in his direction, he was gone. I barely slept that night. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were saying my name, Elliot, over and over in a dozen different voices. I huddled in my RV, the lights flickering as if the thing outside was trying to drain the power. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, or so I thought. I woke to find myself standing at the dam, my feet bare and wet, the burnt scraps of paper clutched in my hand. I had no memory of leaving the RV. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to piece together what had happened. The dam seemed different in the pale light, darker, more alive. My camera was sitting on a nearby rock. When I played back the footage, my stomach turned. The video showed me walking toward the dam in the middle of the night, my face blank and expressionless. At one point, I turned to look at the camera. My eyes were empty sockets and my mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't mine. I couldn't do this anymore. I packed up my gear ready to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered uselessly as the whispers swirled around me, growing louder by the second. Then the Shadow Man appeared. He stood just outside the RV, taller than before, his form rippling like smoke. I froze as he raised a hand and pointed toward the dam. The meaning was clear. Come. No, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel like it could save me. Leave me alone. The RV shook violently, as if something massive was trying to tip it over. My mind raced. I grabbed the burnt scraps of paper and sketched one of the symbols onto the floor with a marker. I didn't know what I was doing, but the moment the sigil was complete, the shaking stopped. The Shadow Man paused, his form flickering like a dying flame. It was enough. I threw open the door, sprinted to the dam, and hurled the scraps of paper into the water. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and for a moment I thought the dam would collapse. Then everything went silent. I don't remember much of the drive home. The RV finally started, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was my missing camera, perfectly intact. I almost didn't watch the footage, but curiosity got the better of me. The last clip showed me standing at the dam, surrounded by shadowy figures, their forms twisted and stretched, their faces pale and empty. And then there was me, or something wearing my face, smiling at the camera, my eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I deleted the footage and smashed the camera, but it didn't help. The whispers are still with me, faint but persistent. No matter where I go, I thought I could uncover the truth about Devil's Gate. Instead, I brought it with me. My name is Clara Whitman, and I'm 28 years old. This happened to me deep in Messino National Forest, where I'd gone to document rare birds for a conservation project. I thought it would be a simple solitary trip, just me, my camera, and the wilderness. But what I found out there was something no field guide could prepare me for. The RV rattled as I navigated the narrow dirt roads winding through the forest. It wasn't fancy, but it got me where I needed to go, remote places no one else wanted to bother with. That day, I was heading for a spot I'd read about online, a little used path called Black Feather Trail. It wasn't on official maps, but birdwatchers had claimed it was a haven for the black-throated gray warbler, a species I'd been desperate to document. The forest was dense, the kind of place where cell signals went to die. My generator had been acting up lately, but I wasn't worried. I liked the quiet, or so I thought. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already struggling to pierce through the trees. I parked the RV, grabbed my gear, and set off down the trail, my boots crunching against the leaf-strewn path. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for. The forest felt untouched, alive with potential. But after a while, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, with the rustling of leaves, had vanished. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a black feather lying in the middle of the trail. It was enormous, far too large for any bird I knew of, and its edges seemed sharp, almost metallic. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The texture felt wrong, unnatural. A chill ran down my spine, but I shoved the feather into my pocket and kept walking. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees growing more gnarled and twisted. That's when I saw her. She was standing by a massive ancient tree, her thin frame barely visible through the mist. She wore a tattered shawl, her white hair falling in wispy strands around her face. "Turn back," she said, her voice low and raspy. "This is no place for you." I froze. "Excuse me? You don't belong here," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes were milky white, unseeing, but they seemed to pierce right through me. "I'm just here for the birds," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm a researcher." She tilted her head, a strange smile curling her lips. "The birds don't sing here anymore." Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the fog. I ran after her, but she was gone, leaving no trace, not even footprints. I returned to my RV, unsettled but determined to stay. I wasn't about to let some cryptic warning scare me off. I set up camp and reviewed the photos I'd taken that day. That's when I noticed something strange in one of the photos taken just after I'd picked up the feather. There was a shadowy figure in the background. It was faint, almost hidden among the trees, but it was there. I told myself it was a trick of the light and tried to sleep. That night, I woke to a faint scratching sound. It was coming from outside the RV, soft and deliberate, like claws raking against metal. "Raccoons?" I muttered, grabbing my flashlight. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there, just the forest, silent and still. The next morning, I set out again, determined to find the elusive warbler, but the forest felt different, heavier, darker. As I walked, I spotted movement high in the trees. My heart leapt as I raised my camera, focusing on the shape. It looked like a bird, but it was too large, its wings too jagged. When I clicked the shutter, my camera malfunctioned, the lens jamming. I looked up and the creature was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching me. When I returned to my RV that evening, I found strange patterns etched into the dirt around my campsite. Spirals, concentric circles, and claw-like markings. I radioed Ethan, my mentor and the closest thing I had to a friend on this trip. "Have you ever heard of Black Feather Trail?" I asked. Ethan's voice crackled through the static. "Why the hell are you out there?" "I'm tracking the black-throated gray warbler," I said. "Why? Get out of there, Clara," he said, his tone unusually serious. "The place has a bad reputation. People say it's cursed." I laughed nervously. "Come on, Ethan, curses? Just listen to me," he said. "That trail doesn't want visitors. You need to leave." That night, I woke up to a burning sensation on my arm. When I looked, I saw a black feather-like mark etched into my skin. It wasn't a tattoo. It felt like a scar, raised and hot to the touch. I stumbled outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying though there was no wind. And then I heard it, whispers, soft and sinister, coming from all around me. I turned in circles, shining the light into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw the old woman standing among the trees, but when I blinked, she was gone. The next morning, I decided to leave, but the forest had other plans. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in, their branches scraping against the RV like claws. The trail looped endlessly, no matter which direction I turned. My GPS was useless, and the map might as well have been blank. I parked and stepped outside, shouting into the fog, "What do you want?" The old woman appeared again, her voice echoing like the wind. "You've taken what isn't yours," she said, her eyes fixed on my pocket, the feather. I pulled it out, holding it up. "You mean this? Fine, take it." She shook her head slowly. "It's too late." The fog thickened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers turned to laughter, and shadowy figures began circling me, their shapes flickering and shifting. The old woman stepped closer, her face impossibly aged, like the bark of the ancient trees. "The forest demands a price," she said. I refused to kneel. I refused to give in. Desperation took over, and I grabbed my camera, using the flash to disorient the figures. The burst of light sent them recoiling, their shapes distorting like smoke. I sprinted back to the RV, the shadows closing in behind me. The engine sputtered, but finally roared to life, and I barreled down the trail, the branches clawing at the vehicle. As I broke through the fog, the forest seemed to sigh, as if releasing me. The whispers faded, but in my rearview mirror, I saw the old woman standing in the road, a single black feather clutched in her hand. When I got back to civilization, I discovered the mark on my arm had faded, leaving a faint scar. I developed the photos from the trip, and in every shot of the forest, the shadowy figures were there, watching. One photo in particular stood out, a close-up of the black feather. In its surface, I could see a face reflected, my face twisted in terror. I don't know what's out there on Black Feather Trail, but I'll never go back to find out. My name is Reed Whitaker, and this all went down in 2017 near the Canadian Rockies, just outside Banff National Park. I was a laid-back guy back then, the type who thought taking his old RV on solo camping trips was the pinnacle of freedom. After a messy divorce and 23 years working for the same company, I figured I owed myself some peace and quiet. Turns out, quiet can get real loud when you're alone. I'd parked my RV at a campground that was as remote as I could manage without hiking 10 miles into the wilderness. It had a few hookups, maybe 4 other campers spread out far enough that you couldn't hear their TVs or kids. I wasn't looking for neighbors anyway. The surrounding pines were dense, and the place had that unmistakable smell of damp earth and wood smoke, clean but raw. The guy running the campground, Brent something, was a wiry man in his 60s with a handshake like a bear trap. He'd pointed me to my spot with a cigarette dangling from his lips and muttered something about staying clear of the far trails. When I asked why, he just smirked and said, "You're here for peace, right? No need to go looking for trouble." Cryptic, but I figured it was some bear territory or an old tall tale. Either way, I nodded and left it alone. By late afternoon, I'd set up my little slice of paradise, a folding chair, a cooler of beer, and a paperback I'd been trying to finish for a year. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long shadows that made the forest look alive. Around dinner time, I decided to stretch my legs. The campground had a few marked trails, and I picked the one closest to my site, an easy loop that would get me back before dark. I wasn't looking for adventure, just some fresh air. The trail was peaceful at first. Pine needles softened my steps, and the only sounds were the occasional bird call and the wind rustling the branches. But maybe 15 minutes in, I noticed something odd. The woods were too quiet. Not the serene kind of quiet, more like the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I laughed it off, told myself I'd watched too many crime shows, and kept walking. A few minutes later, I saw it, a tent, shredded and sagging with its poles bent at unnatural angles. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. My gut told me to turn around, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. There was no sign of wildlife damage or weather wear. The rips were clean, like they'd been made with a blade. Then I saw the blood. It wasn't much, just a few dark stains on the fabric, but enough to make my chest tighten. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something watching me, but the woods were still. "All right, Reed, that's your cue," I muttered, turning back toward the trail. I'd barely taken 2 steps when I heard it, a low, wet crunch like someone biting into raw meat. My stomach flipped. The sound came from deeper in the woods, off the trail. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I crept toward it, moving as quietly as I could. The source of the noise came into view. A man crouched over what looked like a deer carcass, except it wasn't a deer. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing on the ground was human, or at least it used to be. Torn clothes, pale flesh marred by gashes, and a face. Its lifeless eyes stared up at the canopy while this man tore into its torso like he was carving a Thanksgiving turkey. I must have gasped or stepped on a twig because the man's head snapped up. He had a gaunt face with sunken cheeks and a beard that looked like it hadn't met a razor in years. His mouth was smeared with blood, and in his hand was a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he stood up, slow and deliberate, and I realized 2 things. He was holding something in his other hand, a chunk of flesh, and he wasn't going to let me leave. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy but calm, like he was explaining the weather. My legs didn't wait for my brain. I bolted back toward the trail, lungs burning and heart hammering. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me. He wasn't fast, but he didn't have to be. He knew these woods, and I didn't. When I finally broke through the tree line and into the campground, I thought I was safe. Then I saw Brent standing by the fire pit lighting another cigarette. I ran up to him, gasping out a half-coherent explanation. He didn't flinch. Instead, he glanced toward the woods and said, "So you met Miles. Who the hell is Miles?" I demanded, trying to catch my breath. Brent sighed as if this was an inconvenience more than anything. Local nut job. Used to live in town until he got weird. Keeps to himself mostly, but every now and then he'll wander too close. Guess you found his dinner. His dinner? That was a person! Brent's expression darkened. You sure about that? I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. The body had been wrong. Too pale, too mangled. But that didn't make it any less human. Brent shook his head and muttered something about calling the sheriff in the morning. Best you stay in your RV tonight. Lock the doors. That wasn't good enough for me. I wasn't going to sleep knowing that lunatic was out there. I grabbed the tire iron from my RV and told Brent I was going back, with or without him. He shrugged and followed, grumbling about how he didn't get paid enough for this. The trail was even darker now, and every sound made me jump. Brent led the way, holding a flashlight that barely cut through the gloom. We reached the spot where I'd seen the body, but it was gone. Only the shredded tent remained. Brent scanned the area with his light, and that's when we saw the tracks, boot prints leading deeper into the woods. Your call, Brent said, his tone making it clear he thought this was a bad idea. I nodded, gripping the tire iron tighter. We followed the tracks, moving slower now. The trail led us to a small clearing with an old, rusted camper, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar. Brent motioned for me to stay back as he approached. He peered inside, then recoiled, gagging. What is it? I whispered, stepping closer. You don't want to know, he said, but I looked anyway. Inside were bones, human bones, picked clean and piled like firewood. My stomach churned and I stumbled back, barely keeping my dinner down. Brent's face was pale now, his earlier nonchalance replaced by genuine fear. We need to leave, he said. Now! That's when my voice came from the trees. Leaving so soon? We spun around and there he was, standing just outside the clearing, knife in hand. But he wasn't alone. Two more men stepped out of the shadows, both just as ragged and unsettling. One carried an axe, the other held a length of chain. Oh hell, Brent muttered. Miles took a step closer, his smile all teeth. You shouldn't have come here, but since you did, why don't you stay for dinner? They lunged. Brent swung the flashlight, catching the axe guy in the jaw. I swung my tire iron wildly, clipping the chain guy's shoulder. Miles came at me, slashing with his knife, but I managed to block it with the iron. He was fast, too fast, and I knew I couldn't keep this up. Brent yelled, "Run!" and I didn't argue. I sprinted back toward the trail, hearing the chaos behind me, grunts, crashes, the sickening thud of metal on flesh. I didn't stop until I reached the campground. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, locking myself in the RV. I waited for hours, clutching the tire iron and jumping at every noise. Brent never came back. The next morning, the sheriff arrived with a team. They found the clearing, the camper, and the bones. Brent's body was discovered not far from the trail, his head caved in. As for Miles and his crew, they were gone. The sheriff told me they'd been on the radar for years, a group of drifters with a taste for human flesh. Locals called them the Banff Butchers. I sold the RV a week later and never went camping again. I was expecting a quiet shift, patrolling the edges of Carson National Forest, but by sundown I was knee-deep in a nightmare. My name is Dale Tummond, and this happened in the fall of 1988, back when I was a deputy sheriff in a little New Mexico town that most people couldn't find on a map. I'd signed up for this job, thinking I'd be handling rowdy teenagers and the occasional drunk at the bar. I wasn't ready for what I encountered that night. It started around 2 p.m. when the dispatcher called about a missing hiker. The man's wife, frantic and tearful, said he'd gone out early in the morning and hadn't come back. Carson is a sprawling place, dense with pine trees and winding trails that disappear into the wilderness. I grabbed my flashlight, a service revolver, and my old Remington 870 from the cruiser. I didn't like heading into the forest with just a sidearm. You never know what you'll run into out there. I arrived at the trailhead where the wife was pacing near her car, biting her nails to the quick. Her name was Sandra Keeling. Her husband, Victor, was an experienced hiker who had planned to explore one of the lesser-used paths. "He's never out this late," Sandra said, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to find him." I reassured her as best I could and radioed for backup, but the closest unit was tied up with domestic dispute an hour away. With no one else available, I headed in alone. The trail started easy, packed dirt, tall trees casting shadows that danced in the breeze. But as I got deeper, the forest grew quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots and the rustle of dry leaves. Around 4:30 p.m., I found a torn backpack hanging from a tree branch. The straps looked like they'd been sliced through, but not cleanly, more like something jagged had shredded them. There were no tracks, no sign of Victor, but a crawling feeling up my spine told me to stay alert. The sun was low in the sky when I stumbled upon a campsite. 2 tents, a smoldering fire pit, and blood. A lot of it. It was splashed on the side of one tent and soaked into the ground. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter as I scanned the area. "Victor!" I called out. The name echoed through the trees, but no one answered. The tents were abandoned, and the contents, sleeping bags, a lantern, some canned food, were scattered as if whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I found no bodies, but something about the scene felt off. The blood wasn't just on the ground, it was on the trees, smeared in long, deliberate streaks. I radioed the station, but the signal was spotty. All I managed to get through was, "Found a campsite, blood everywhere, no sign of," before the static swallowed my voice. Dusk was setting in, and the forest felt oppressive. The towering pines closed in like prison walls. I debated heading back, but leaving without answers didn't sit right. I followed a faint trail leading away from the campsite, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. That's when I saw the first body. It was slumped against a rock, partially hidden by underbrush. Male, mid-30s, and his chest was torn open. I'd seen bear attacks before. This wasn't one. The wounds were too precise, almost surgical. His face was twisted in terror, his mouth frozen mid-scream. I knelt down to check for ID when the stench hit me, metallic and foul, like rotting meat left in the sun. Before I could process the scene, a noise snapped me to attention. It was faint, like a branch snapping underfoot, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I swung the flashlight around, the beam bouncing off the trees. "Who's there?" I barked, my voice steadier than I felt. Silence. Then from the shadows it stepped out. At first I thought it was a man. It stood upright, lanky but muscular, its frame too elongated to be human. The skin was a mottled gray, stretched tight over its body, and its hands ended in claws that glinted in the flashlight's beam. Its head tilted, and for a second I thought it was studying me, deciding whether I was worth the trouble. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the trees, and the creature staggered back, but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a rasping sound, almost like laughter, and charged. I fired again, aiming for the chest this time, and the creature jerked to a stop, blood spraying from the wound, but it wasn't enough to drop it. It swiped at me with those claws, catching the edge of my vest and sending me sprawling. My flashlight flew out of my hand, plunging the world into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, pumping another shell into the shotgun. The creature lunged again, and I pulled the trigger point blank. The shot tore into its shoulder, and this time it stumbled, crashing into a tree. I didn't wait for it to recover. I bolted, sprinting back toward the campsite, the shotgun clutched tight in my hands. The forest came alive around me, branches snapping, the sound of something huge crashing through the underbrush. I could hear it gaining, its footsteps heavy and relentless. I made it back to the tents and dove into the first one, using the canvas as a makeshift barricade. The creature tore through the fabric like it was tissue paper, and I barely had time to roll out of the way. I grabbed a nearby lantern and hurled it at its head. The glass shattered, flames licking at its skin. It shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring, and swiped at the flames, giving me just enough time to grab my revolver. I emptied the cylinder into its chest, each shot landing with a sickening thud. The creature staggered, finally dropping to its knees. I grabbed the shotgun, loaded one last shell, and aimed for its head. The blast was deafening, and when the smoke cleared, the creature lay still, its body sprawled awkwardly in the dirt. I didn't wait to check if it was dead. I radioed for backup, my voice shaking as I gave them my location. By the time the other deputies arrived, the creature was still there, its twisted body proof of what I'd faced. The campsite and the bodies told a grim story, but none of it explained what that thing was or why it had attacked. They took me back to town, and a team was sent in to clean up the scene. The official report said animal attack, but I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't from any world I recognized. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all anyone needs to know. My name is Ben Harper, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in the spring of last year, during what was supposed to be a laid-back hiking trip in Yosemite National Park. It's taken me months to piece together what I saw, to even believe it myself. Honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. It started with a simple idea. Film an off-the-beaten-path trek for my YouTube channel. I've been documenting hiking trips for years, focusing on little-known trails, urban legends, and survival tips. This time I chose Hetchy Valley, a quieter part of Yosemite that's as beautiful as it is remote. Joining me were my girlfriend Nina, 29, her bright caution always balancing my adventurous streak, my lifelong buddy Travis, 31, who's fearless to a fault, and Kelly, a shy 26-year-old who was tagging along for her first real hike. This will be epic, I told them as we piled into the car. Untouched trails, hidden waterfalls, plus the myths about spirits guarding the valley. People eat that stuff up. Nina gave me a look. Let's not eat it up too much ourselves, okay? Travis smirked. Ben, I bet you're just hoping for a ghost cameo in your video. Top 10 haunted, right? Kelly stayed quiet, fidgeting with her pack straps. We reached the trailhead around midday. The sun glinted off Hetchy's reservoir. The granite cliffs stood tall around us, and a faint breeze carried the scent of pine. You guys ready? I asked, camera in hand. Kelly nodded hesitantly. Yeah, totally ready. The first day went smoothly, aside from Kelly struggling with her boots. By evening, we'd set up camp in a small clearing near the tree line. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep hush settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's expectant. We sat around the fire, the warmth fighting off the night's chill. I was reviewing some footage when Nina stiffened beside me. Do you hear that? She asked. I strained my ears. At first there was nothing, but then faint and melodic came the sound of whistling. It's just the wind, Travis said, tossing another log onto the fire. It's not the wind, Nina shot back. Kelly looked up, her eyes wide. It's weird, like it's trying to sound human. I chuckled nervously. Guys, relax, it's probably just some bird. But deep down, something about it unsettled me. The next day, we hiked deeper into the valley. The trail became rougher, the markers sparse. Around noon, we started noticing odd scratches on the trees, long, deliberate marks that didn't look natural. Mountain lion, maybe? I suggested. Nina frowned. A mountain lion carving symbols into the bark? She wasn't wrong. Some of the marks almost resembled letters, though not in any language I recognized. Kelly hung back, her steps faltering. I don't like this. Can we just turn around? We're fine, Travis said seriously. It's just some bored campers messing around. Yeah, I agreed, though the unease in my gut was growing. We'll camp tonight and head back tomorrow. That evening, the whistling returned. It seemed closer now, circling our camp. Nina grabbed my arm. Ben, that's not a bird. Travis, trying to lighten the mood, stood and whistled back. The sound stopped abruptly. Travis, Nina snapped. He grinned. What? It's probably just some other hikers. But as the silence stretched on, even his bravado faded. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Light, deliberate steps, like someone trying to avoid being heard. Nina? I whispered. She stirred beside me. What? You hear that? Her eyes widened, and she nodded. We lay frozen, listening as the steps moved around the camp. Then from Kelly's tent came a faint, trembling voice. Mom? Nina bolted upright. What the hell? I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold. Kelly was standing by the edge of the clearing, her back to us. "Kelly?" I called. She didn't respond. Travis stumbled out of his tent, groggy. "What's going on?" Nina grabbed his arm. "Something's wrong with Kelly." I moved closer to her. "Kelly, hey, what's going on?" She turned slowly, her face pale. "I heard her. My mom, she's out there. She's calling me." Nina stepped forward. "Kelly, your mom isn't here. You're just, no." Kelly interrupted, her voice shaking. "I heard her. She's out there." Behind her, the woods seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting unnaturally. "Get back to the tent," I said firmly, my heart pounding. Kelly hesitated, then nodded, her gaze lingering on the dark trees. The next morning, we woke to find Kelly gone. Her footprints led toward the reservoir, but the trail became erratic, crisscrossing itself. We followed her cries for help, but they came from all directions, overlapping and distorted. Then we found her, or something that looked like her. She stood in a clearing, her back to us again. "Kelly?" Nina called. She turned, but her movements were wrong, jerky as though she were a puppet on strings. Her face was blank, her eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. "That's not Kelly," Nina whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin, and took a step toward us. Its form began to shift, growing taller, its limbs elongating. The skinwalker. There was no denying it now. It let out a low, guttural laugh. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted. The creature's footsteps pounded behind us. Travis, always the bravest or the dumbest, stopped and grabbed a branch. "Keep going," he yelled. "Travis, no!" Nina screamed, but he charged the creature. I looked back just in time to see it swipe at him, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack. We didn't stop running until we reached a marked trail. Only then did we collapse, gasping for breath. "We can't leave him," Nina sobbed. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "He's gone." Kelly appeared from the trees then, or what was left of her. Her voice was a warped echo of itself, and her eyes gleamed with malevolence. The skinwalker had taken her. We made it back to the trailhead by nightfall, though it felt like days had passed. I don't remember much of the drive home, just Nina's hand gripping mine tightly, her knuckles white. Travis's body was never found. Neither was Kelly's. I've stopped filming my hikes, but sometimes I catch myself reviewing that last footage, searching for answers. And in the final clip, just before the camera cuts out, I see Travis standing among the trees, his eyes glowing faintly, a grotesque smile twisting his face. My name is Oliver Albert, and I'm 32 years old. This happened just a few months ago when I decided to drive my RV up the Lost Coast in Northern California. I wanted to escape my life, what little was left of it. My marriage was over, my photography career was circling the drain, and I'd stopped talking to my family years ago. This trip was supposed to be my reset, my way of finding something real to hold on to. I got more than I bargained for. It was early November, and the coastal air was damp and heavy as I made my way north on winding roads. My RV wasn't fancy, but it was reliable enough. I had my camera gear, a few days' worth of supplies, and an old tattered map I picked up at a gas station. That's where I first saw it. The map had a stretch of road marked with thick red ink. Highway 211, closed to all traffic. It wasn't on Google Maps, and I couldn't find any mention of it online. I thought it would make for an interesting story, an abandoned highway swallowed by time and nature. Maybe I could even snap some award-winning photos of the eerie, forgotten stretch. I should have left it alone. I was driving through Shelter Cove when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, her dark hair falling in waves over her face. I almost didn't stop, but something about her felt familiar, like I'd seen her before, though I couldn't place where. She smiled as she climbed in, tossing a small beat-up backpack onto the seat. "Thanks for stopping," she said. "Not a lot of people do these days." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just up the coast." We didn't talk much after that. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. Her clothes looked out of place, like they were from another decade, and her hands, they were pale and cold, like she'd been standing in the fog for hours. We passed the last town, and I saw the faded sign for Highway 2011. It was barely legible, almost swallowed by overgrown bushes. Road closed. No entry. "That's it," Janine said softly, staring out the window. I glanced at her. "You've been here before?" "Once," she murmured. "A long time ago." Something in her tone made the hair on my neck stand up, but I shook it off and turned onto the narrow, crumbling road. The RV's tires crunched on gravel as the trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and heavy like a living thing. It clung to the RV, muffling the sound of the engine. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Then the radio started acting up. I wasn't even playing music, but static crackled through the speakers, and underneath it, I could have sworn I heard voices, faint, almost like whispers. "You hear that?" I asked Janine. She didn't answer. Her face was pressed against the window, staring into the fog. That's when I saw the car. It was an old, rusted sedan, half buried in mud and leaning at an unnatural angle. The windows were shattered, and the driver's door hung open. "Looks like it's been here a while," I said, but Janine didn't respond. I glanced at her. She looked pale, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. "Everything okay?" I asked. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide. "We shouldn't have come here." About a mile later, we saw the lodge. It was an old roadside building, its paint peeling and its sign barely legible, "Hilltop, Vacancy." "I don't remember this being here," Janine said under her breath. "It's probably abandoned," I replied, but something about it pulled at me. We parked outside, and I grabbed my camera, eager to get some shots of the decaying structure. The air smelled damp and musty, and the windows were cracked or boarded up. As I snapped photos, I noticed something strange. The wallpaper inside the building, visible through the broken windows, seemed to form patterns, faces contorted and screaming. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then came the tapping, slow, deliberate knocks on the windows. I sat up, clutching my flashlight. "Janine?" I whispered. "Did you hear that?" She didn't move. She was sitting up straight, staring at the door. "They're coming," she said flatly. My blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the tapping turned into pounding. The RV shook as if something massive was slamming against it. I grabbed the keys and started the engine, desperate to get away, but the headlights only illuminated dense fog. Then I saw them, figures in the mist, their outlines shifting and flickering. They had no faces, just empty voids where eyes and mouths should have been. "They won't let us leave," Janine said, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. She turned to me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "I didn't survive the crash," she whispered. "I thought I did, but I've been here ever since, waiting." The words didn't make sense. "You're not making any sense." "I've been trying to leave, but they won't let me. They need someone new to take my place." We drove back to the lodge, the pounding growing louder as the figures closed in. The lodge seemed to glow faintly in the fog, its windows alive with flickering light. "They want you to stay," Janine said, "but you can fight them. You have to." I didn't know what to believe anymore. I grabbed my camera and started taking photos, hoping the flash would drive them back. Each time the light went off, the figures recoiled, their shapes distorting. Janine stayed behind, her form flickering like static on an old TV. "Go," she shouted, "before it's too late." I didn't want to leave her, but I could feel the darkness closing in. The RV roared to life, and I sped down the crumbling road. The lodge and its horrors disappeared into the fog behind me. I made it to a ranger station at dawn. When I told Ranger Matthews what happened, he just shook his head. "That stretch of road? It's cursed. People go there, but they don't always come back. Or if they do, they're different." I didn't tell him about Janine. I wasn't sure she'd ever really been there. Back in the city, I developed the photos. They were clear as day. Janine, standing beside the lodge, her face pale and hollow. And in the last photo, taken from inside the RV, I saw something that still haunts me. A figure standing behind me, its faceless head tilted as if it were smiling. My name is Cale Benjamin, and back in 2014, I had an experience that still feels more vivid than the memories of the years before or after it. I was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, taking my RV out for a much-needed break from what I like to call the treadmill of modern life. I'd been through a nasty divorce and thought a solo trip to clear my head would be just what I needed. I was a city boy trying to find some calm in nature, but it turned out that nature had different plans for me. I pulled into a relatively secluded campground late in the afternoon, parked my RV, and set up. The air was crisp, carrying that slightly damp, earthy smell you only get in thick woods. There were a few other campers scattered about, but the place was quiet, exactly what I'd hoped for. My neighbors were a couple in their late 40s who gave me a quick wave before disappearing into their camper. On the other side of me was a guy who looked like he was in his 60s, with an old Ford truck and a tent that had seen better days. I made small talk with him briefly while unpacking. His name was Marty, and he had one of those dry senses of humor that made you chuckle before you realized he just insulted you. He joked that I'd probably burn my dinner if I tried cooking it over a fire. I laughed it off, but when he added that this place really isn't where you'd want to mess up and get noticed, it felt like a joke with a razor edge. I didn't think much of it at the time. As the evening wore on, the campground quieted. The couple's lights went out early, leaving only Marty and me with flickering firelight. I grilled a steak, drank a beer, and tried not to overthink things. Around 10 p.m., I started to hear movement in the woods behind the RV. At first, I chalked it up to animals. It's the wilderness. Deer, raccoons, maybe a black bear. Nothing I hadn't prepared for. But as the night deepened, the sounds became less sporadic and more deliberate. Branches cracked, and there was a faint rustling that didn't seem like the wind. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing. A hollow laugh came from Marty's campsite. "Don't worry," he called out. "Could be worse. Could be someone trying to sneak up on you." Not exactly comforting, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't get under my skin. I double-checked the locks on my RV and decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, the sounds outside seemed to amplify. By now, it wasn't just cracking branches. There were soft footfalls circling the RV, almost as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. Around midnight, the RV shook slightly, like someone had leaned against it. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and contemplated calling the park rangers. But what would I even say? "I think someone's creeping around my RV?" It felt ridiculous. I decided to wait it out. Big mistake. The next morning, I found muddy handprints smeared across the windows and sides of the RV. I was creeped out, but convinced myself it was some local prankster. Marty was gone, his tent packed up and his old truck missing. The couple from the other site had left too. I was now alone. Determined not to let paranoia ruin my trip, I spent the morning hiking. The trails were beautiful, the kind of serene that almost makes you forget how unforgiving nature can be. I even laughed at myself for getting worked up the night before. By the time I returned to the RV, it was late afternoon and I was sweaty, hungry, and ready to relax. That's when I noticed something off. The door to my RV was slightly ajar. I'd locked it before leaving. My stomach sank. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I moved to the kitchen area, I found a single muddy boot print on the floor. That's when I realized my hunting knife was missing from its sheath on the counter. Adrenaline surged through me as I searched the RV again. Whoever had been inside was gone, but the realization that someone had breached my space left me feeling exposed and furious. I decided to pack up and leave. As I loaded the RV, I spotted movement in the woods. A tall, wiry man emerged, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. His face was sharp, almost gaunt, with a grin that felt too wide, like he was in on some cosmic joke I didn't understand. He stopped about 20 feet from me, just standing there, watching. "Lose something?" he asked, his voice gravelly and taunting. I didn't answer. My instinct told me to keep loading and get out of there. He took a step closer. "You don't look like you belong here," he said. "People like you never stick around long." "Not my problem," I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Not yet anyway." I climbed into the RV and locked the door. As I started the engine, he stood there, unbothered, still grinning. I peeled out of the campground and onto the main road, my heart racing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting him to appear again. After driving for about 20 minutes, I pulled into a gas station to collect myself. The attendant, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, gave me a once-over and asked if I was okay. I explained what had happened, and she didn't look surprised. "You must have run into Pete," she said. "Guy's been squatting out there for years. Rangers can't catch him, and he's mean as a snake. You're lucky you didn't find him in your RV." The thought sent a chill through me. I asked if she'd heard about him hurting anyone. She hesitated. "Not anyone that made it back to tell the tale." I didn't stick around to find out more. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything. They took it seriously, which was a small comfort, but when I asked what they planned to do, one ranger shrugged. "If it's Pete, he's been out there for decades, knows those woods better than we do. We'll check it out, but it's a big park." I didn't return to that campground or any campground for years. A few weeks later, I read an article about a missing hiker in the same area. It mentioned they'd found a campsite with strange markings carved into trees and an old hunting knife stuck in a log. I never checked to see if it was mine. As for Pete, the Rangers believed he was some sort of survivalist gone rogue, a man who had rejected society and lived off the grid, preying on the vulnerable. They never found him, but sometimes I think about his grin and wonder how many others it's been the last thing they've seen. My name is Alex Mason. I'm 31 years old, a freelance journalist who specializes in debunking urban legends and supernatural stories. This happened last June during a trip to Death Valley National Park. I went there to prove that the so-called Devil's Highway was nothing more than an empty stretch of desert road with a spooky name. I wasn't expecting to find anything real. I certainly wasn't expecting to barely escape with my life. I arrived in the park late in the afternoon, the sun blazing down on the cracked asphalt and the vast, desolate landscape stretching out in every direction. My RV was loaded with supplies, water, food, and gear for a few days of camping. I had a map of the region and notes about Furnace Flats, an old mining settlement tied to some of the most enduring legends about Death Valley. The drive was uneventful at first. The monotony of the desert was almost comforting, the kind of silence you don't get in the city. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the sand in shades of red and gold, the road began to feel different. It was subtle at first. Landmarks I'd marked on the map didn't match what I saw. A weathered sign for a service station appeared at the side of the road, though I hadn't passed any stations in hours. The sign was blank, its words faded away. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. I chalked it up to heat mirages and kept driving, but when the engine started to overheat, my calm began to crack. The RV sputtered to a stop as I pulled onto a narrow dirt path leading toward Furnace Flats. Steam hissed from under the hood, and I cursed, stepping out into the sweltering heat. The air hit me like a wall, dry and suffocating. Sweat dripped down my back as I lifted the hood and peered inside. I'm not a mechanic, but it didn't take one to see the problem. The radiator was shot. I could feel the heat radiating off it as I grabbed my water jug and poured what little I could spare over the engine. It was no use. I had no cell service, no working vehicle, and no choice but to wait until the temperature dropped enough to hike back to the main road. Until then, I was stuck. As night fell, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to a biting cold, and the vast emptiness became an echo chamber for every little sound. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp and mournful. The wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying with it faint sounds I couldn't place. I tried to focus on my notes, jotting down observations by flashlight. The silence was unnerving, and I welcomed the distraction of headlights appearing in the distance. At first I thought it was another traveler. As the lights approached, I stepped out to wave them down, but when the vehicle came into view, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a car. It was a man carrying a lantern that glowed with an unnatural pale light. His clothes were old-fashioned, dusty boots, a long coat, and a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with an ease that didn't match the harshness of the terrain, his steps silent against the gravel. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You look like you could use some help." Yeah," I stammered. "My RV broke down. Do you know if there's a service station nearby?" He tilted his head, his face half hidden in the shadows of his hat. "Nearest station's a ways off. You won't make it on foot, not out here." Something about him unsettled me. His presence was too sudden, too convenient. I tried to shake the feeling. "You heading to Furnace Flats?" he asked. "How'd you know that?" "Not much else out this way," he said with a thin smile. "I can show you the way." I hesitated. His offer sounded helpful, but something about his demeanor felt off. Before I could answer, he turned and began walking down the dirt road, the lantern swinging in his hand. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The moonlight painted the desert in shades of silver and shadow, and his lantern cast an eerie glow on the ground ahead. He didn't speak, and the silence grew heavier with each step. After what felt like hours, we crested a ridge, and I stopped short. In the valley below was a cluster of buildings, weathered shacks, a water tower, and the outline of a mine entrance. Furnace Flats. But something was wrong. The buildings shimmered, their edges blurring like heat waves. I blinked, and for a moment they vanished entirely, replaced by an empty expanse of sand. When I looked again, they were back. The man turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Go on, it's what you came for, isn't it?" I made my way down the slope, the man lingering at the top of the ridge. As I approached the settlement, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and the whispers began. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but as I stepped closer to the mine, they grew louder, voices overlapping in an urgent, desperate cacophony. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, warning. Inside the mine, the darkness was absolute. My flashlight beam flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it, a shape moving at the edge of the light, too fast to follow. I froze, my heart pounding. The whispers rose to a fever pitch and the air around me grew colder. I turned to leave, but the entrance was gone. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing the light. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. Its eyes burned like embers, and its voice was a low, guttural growl. "You shouldn't be here," it said, each word dragging like a blade. I tried to run, but the sand beneath my feet seemed to pull me down, holding me in place. The figure loomed closer, its features twisting into something monstrous. "You want to leave?" it hissed. "There's a price." I don't know what gave me the strength to resist. Maybe it was my stubborn skepticism, or maybe it was sheer survival instinct. I refused to answer the figure's question, forcing myself to focus on the faint glow of the lantern in the distance. Using the stars as my guide, I retraced my steps, dragging myself out of the valley. The figure followed, its whispers clawing at my mind, but it couldn't touch me. When I reached the ridge, the man with the lantern was gone. Back at the RV, I found the engine miraculously working, as if nothing had been wrong in the first place. I didn't question it. I drove until the sun rose, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never finished the article. Some stories don't need debunking. Some are better left untold. My name is Anna Sophia, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in early October, just as the leaves began to change, but before the heavy snowfalls could bury the trails. My friends and I had planned a 3-day camping trip on Mount Shasta, a place I've hiked countless times. I thought I knew the mountain. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting golden light across the jagged peaks. Liam, my fiancé, parked our SUV near the trailhead where Jordan and Kelsey were waiting. Jordan, my best friend since high school, was practically bouncing with excitement, his hiking boots crunching against the gravel. He was 30, lanky, and had that mischievous grin that usually meant trouble. Kelsey, a friend of Jordan's I barely knew, was a stark contrast. Around my age, she had bright eyes and an air of calm about her that I found reassuring. She offered a quick smile as I introduced Liam, who nodded politely. Liam, at 31, was the kind of person you wanted with you on a trip like this. Steady and cautious, though maybe a little too much for Jordan's taste. "This place is incredible," Jordan said, spinning in a slow circle. "You know, people say Mount Shasta is a vortex for supernatural energy. We might see something cool, or we might just enjoy the scenery." Liam said, pulling his pack from the car. "We'll see." Jordan smirked. "Don't worry, Mr. Logic, I brought a spirit board just in case." I groaned. "Jordan, no! We talked about this. Leave that nonsense in the car." "Relax, Anna," he said. "It's just for fun." The first day was perfect. The trail was steep but manageable, and the views were spectacular. We set up camp near Castle Lake, a serene body of water surrounded by dense forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and toasting marshmallows. Even Liam seemed to relax. That night, I woke to the sound of faint singing. It was high-pitched and melodic, drifting through the trees like the wind carrying a distant lullaby. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The others were asleep, their breaths steady and deep. The singing faded, and I told myself it was just the wind. I closed my eyes and willed myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found Jordan inspecting his tent. One of the poles had snapped clean in half. "It's weird," he said. "I swear it was fine last night." "We'll fix it later," I said, glancing uneasily at the tree line. "We need to move if we want to reach the next site before dark." As we passed, I noticed my compass spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, but nothing helped. Then Liam's GPS started acting up, displaying error messages despite the clear sky. Kelsey frowned as she watched us. "Something feels off," she said softly. Jordan laughed. "Probably Anna's bad vibes because I brought the spirit board." Liam shot him a glare. "You're not seriously still planning to use that thing, are you?" Jordan shrugged. "Maybe." The second campsite was deeper into the forest, more secluded. By the time we reached it, the trees loomed so high above us they seemed to block out the sun. We set up camp quickly, though the uneasy feeling from the morning lingered. That evening, Jordan insisted on pulling out the spirit board. "Let's just see if anyone wants to talk," he said, wiggling his eyebrows. "No way," I snapped. "I'm serious. This isn't funny." But Jordan was already setting it up, and Kelsey, to my surprise, didn't protest. She watched with quiet curiosity as he placed his fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" he asked in a sing-song voice. "Any spirits want to chat?" The fire crackled and a cold breeze swept through the campsite. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked under Jordan's fingers. "Whoa," he whispered, his grin fading. "Jordan, stop messing around," Liam said. "I'm not," Jordan said, his voice low. "It's moving on its own." The planchette spelled out one word: leave. We all froze. Even Jordan looked shaken. "That's enough," I said, grabbing the board and throwing it into the fire. The flames roared higher for a brief moment, and then everything went still. Too still. The usual hum of the forest, crickets rustling, leaves rustling, distant animal calls, had vanished. That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, and it wasn't alone. Whispers joined the melody, soft and insidious, circling our campsite like invisible predators, and then came the footsteps. Liam sat bolt upright, clutching my arm. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the firelight. Jordan grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. "Hello?" he called. "Who's out there?" The beam landed on something. Someone. A figure stood just beyond the light, motionless. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long. His face was obscured by shadow. "Hey!" Jordan yelled, stepping closer. "Jordan, don't!" I hissed. The figure tilted its head and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Then it stepped forward just enough for the light to reveal its face. Its eyes were empty pockets, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, glistening teeth. We didn't sleep. We huddled by the fire, clutching knives and makeshift weapons as the creature prowled the edge of the campsite. It didn't attack but made its presence known, scratching at trees, growling, mimicking our voices. At one point, it called Liam's name in my voice, and he nearly walked into the woods before Kelsey grabbed him. "We need to leave," she whispered. "At night?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "It'll pick us off one by one," I said, my voice firm despite the terror gripping me. "We have to try." At first light, we packed our gear and started back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in, the trail vanishing and reappearing in places it shouldn't. Then Jordan screamed. We turned to see him sprawled on the ground, claw marks raking across his chest. Blood soaked his shirt and his face was pale as he gasped for air. "It's here," he choked out. Kelsey grabbed a handful of salt from our cooking supplies and scattered it around Jordan. The creature appeared again just beyond the circle, its empty eyes fixed on us. It growled but didn't cross the salt. "It can't pass," Kelsey said, her voice trembling. "Salt's a barrier." We built another fire and surrounded it with salt, waiting for the creature to weaken as the sun rose higher. When it finally retreated into the shadows, we carried Jordan and ran. We made it back to the trailhead by noon, battered and terrified but alive. Jordan was rushed to the hospital, his wounds deep but not life-threatening. When we told a local ranger what had happened, he went pale. "People talk about skinwalkers up there," he said. "They're not just stories. You're lucky to be alive." I didn't feel lucky. None of us did. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far into its domain. Mount Shasta is beautiful, but it hides a darkness I'll never forget. My name is Howard Cartwright, and this happened to me back in October 1994 while hiking in the Dunes National Forest in Oregon. At the time, I was in my mid-30s, trying to shake off the grind of my monotonous office job in Portland. I'd always found solace in the wilderness, and this trip was meant to be just another weekend escape from the hum of city life. Little did I know it would nearly cost me my life. That morning, the forest was wrapped in a veil of early fog, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles the world around you. I parked at a trailhead near Sparks Lake, packed light, and intended to camp by a spot overlooking the lava fields. The air was crisp with the tang of pine and earth, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional call of a crow. I had been walking for hours when I spotted the first odd thing, a tattered orange backpack snagged in the branches of a tall fir. It looked like it had been there for a while, frayed and weathered by the elements. I stopped and stared at it, debating whether to climb up and check it out. My instincts told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. The climb was tricky, the bark rough against my palms, but I managed to snag the bag. Inside were some torn maps, a broken compass, and an old Polaroid camera. The film cartridge was missing, but what struck me was the dried blood on the strap. My stomach twisted, but I convinced myself it was just an old hunting accident. I stuffed it in my pack and pressed on, ignoring the chill creeping up my spine. By late afternoon, the fog lifted, giving way to golden sunlight that dappled through the canopy. I set up camp on a small ridge overlooking the lava fields. The landscape below looked alien, jagged black rocks stretching for miles. As I prepared my dinner, I kept glancing back at the backpack. Something about it felt wrong, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Nightfall came quickly, and with it an unnatural quiet. Even the crickets seemed to hush. I stoked my fire, trying to dispel the unease settling in my chest. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A sharp, wet crunch like bones snapping under weight. I froze, my hand gripping the hilt of a small hunting knife I carried. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the faintest rustle of underbrush. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated the dense thicket. "Who's there?" I called, trying to steady my voice. No answer. Just the oppressive silence, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, but nothing else happened. By dawn, my nerves were frayed, but I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a cougar or a bear. I packed up and decided to cut my trip short. The forest, however, seemed to have other plans. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I began noticing subtle changes. Trees that looked familiar seemed out of place. Fallen logs I hadn't seen before blocked my path. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, leading me deeper into its grasp. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A clearing littered with animal carcasses. Deer, raccoons, and what looked like a coyote. Their bodies were arranged in a crude circle, bones stripped bare and glinting in the sun. At the center was something that looked like an altar, a slab of rock smeared with what I could only assume was blood. My breath hitched as I scanned the area, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in what looked like tattered clothing. But as it turned its head toward me, I realized it was something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a grotesque amalgamation of exposed muscle and sinew. Its mouth split wide into something resembling a grin. I didn't think. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I bolted, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The thing chased me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, like it was dragging something behind it. I could hear its raspy breaths, each exhale sounding like a predator savoring the hunt. I reached a rocky outcrop and scrambled up, barely keeping my footing. The creature let out a noise that turned my stomach, a high-pitched keening that echoed through the trees. It didn't try to climb after me, but circled the base, its movements deliberate, calculating. I threw a rock at it, hitting its shoulder, but it didn't flinch. Desperation clawed at my mind as I scanned my surroundings. That's when I spotted the narrow crevice in the rocks, a potential hiding spot. I squeezed into the gap, the stones scraping against my back, and held my breath. The creature's footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside my hiding spot. I could hear it sniffing, the sound nauseatingly wet. It crouched down, peering into the crevice, its grotesque face inches from mine. In the dim light, I could see its torso covered in scars, some fresh and oozing. It tilted its head, as if trying to decide whether to reach in or move on. And then it lunged, an arm shooting into the crevice. Its claws raked my leg, drawing blood, but I kicked back with all my strength, slamming my boot into its distorted hand. It snarled and recoiled, giving me just enough time to crawl deeper into the crevice. The creature pounded against the rocks, its frustration evident. I felt the vibrations reverberate through the stone, but the crevice held firm. After what felt like an eternity, the pounding stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, until I was certain it was gone. Hours passed before I dared to crawl out. My leg throbbed where it clawed me, the wound ugly but not deep. I limped my way back to the trailhead, clutching my knife like a lifeline. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look back. Later, I handed the bloody backpack to the authorities, who seemed skeptical of my story but took it for evidence. A search team was sent into the forest, but found nothing. No altar, no carcasses, no sign of the creature. I never went hiking alone again. I thought it was just another day in the field, another operation deep in the wild, but now I'm here trying to wrap my head around how it all went to hell. My name is Mason Gaves, and this happened in October 1986, somewhere in the dense, shadowed expanse of the Ozark National Forest. I was working a covert reconnaissance mission as a Green Beret tasked with investigating reports of unusual disturbances in the area. Locals had been whispering about people disappearing, livestock being torn apart in ways no known predator could manage, and strange sounds that carried through the trees at night. The brass didn't take it seriously, but the assignment came down anyway. A box we could tick off while we prepped for something bigger. The forest was massive, a thick tangle of hickories and pines that swallowed the sun by mid-afternoon. It was the kind of place that had secrets, hidden caves, forgotten trails, and a quiet that pressed down on you like a weight. I was with two other guys from my unit, Colin Dry, a sarcastic marksman with a knack for calling out danger before it happened, and Alex Fry, a medic, quieter but with nerves of steel. We were all armed to the teeth, standard issue M16s, sidearms, and enough equipment to survive weeks out there. It was supposed to be a 2-day recon, nothing more. It didn't take long for things to start feeling wrong. The forest had this eerie stillness, like even the birds and insects knew to stay quiet. We came across a mutilated deer on the first day, its body split open with surgical precision, but there were no signs of predators. Fry crouched beside it, shaking his head. No claw marks, no tracks. Whatever did this, it's not normal, he said, his voice slow. Dry scanned the tree line, his rifle ready. If it's not normal, then it's our job to find it and put it down. Keep moving. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing, just big enough to see the stars through the canopy. We agreed on a rotating watch schedule, but even during my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, we were trained for this. Fear was an enemy you had to keep in check. Then came the noise. It started as a faint rustling in the distance, too deliberate to be the wind. Dry, who was supposed to be sleeping, sat up and grabbed his rifle. Fry was already awake, his eyes darting toward the sound. It was circling us, moving just beyond the edge of our sight. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but the beam only seemed to make the shadows deeper. "Eyes up!" Dry hissed, his tone sharp. Something stepped into the clearing, something that didn't belong. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a hunched frame covered in what looked like patches of matted fur. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of nature as the rest of us. Its face, God, its face was a nightmare, stretched and twisted, like it had been molded by a child who didn't understand what a person should look like. And it was fast. The thing launched at Dry first, its arm whipping out with inhuman speed. He got a shot off, a clean hit in the chest, but it didn't stop. It slammed into him, throwing him into a tree with a sickening crack. Fry yelled something I couldn't make out as he opened fire, the burst sliding up the clearing. I joined in, aiming for its center mass, but it was like shooting at a ghost. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, weaving between the trees, its body contorting unnaturally as it dodged our bullets. Dry wasn't moving. I could see the blood pooling beneath him, dark against the forest floor. "Fall back!" I shouted, grabbing Fry by the vest. We sprinted deeper into the woods, the sound of its pursuit never far behind. It wasn't just running, it was toying with us, letting us think we had a chance before closing the distance again. We reached an old hunting cabin, half-rotted and barely standing, but it was better than nothing. Fry barricaded the door while I checked the ammo count and my rifle. We were running low, too low to take it down. "What the hell is that thing?" Fry panted, his hands shaking as he clutched his sidearm. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it bleeds. That means we can kill it." The cabin was small, with one broken window and a trapdoor leading to a root cellar. We didn't have many options. The creature circled the cabin, its claws scraping against the wood. It was trying to scare us, to make us panic. Then it hit the door. The force was enough to splinter the wood, sending shards flying. I fired through the opening, hearing the satisfying thud of impact. It howled, not like any animal I'd ever heard, but like something ancient, something wrong. Fry fired next, aiming for its head. The thing didn't go down, but it stumbled. That was enough. "Cellar," I yelled. We scrambled down the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind us. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it bought us time. The creature's footsteps thudded above us, slow and deliberate. It was searching, taking its time now. Fry was pale, his breath shallow. "Dry as dead," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I know," I said, gripping my rifle tighter. "But we're not." The creature didn't wait long. It ripped the trapdoor clean off, its grotesque face peering down at us. I didn't think, I just fired, emptying my mag into its chest and neck. It dropped into the cellar, thrashing wildly, its claws tearing through the air. Fry screamed as it caught him, dragging him toward the corner. I grabbed my combat knife and lunged, plunging it into the creature's back with everything I had. The thing roared, its focus shifting to me. Fry was free, crawling toward the stairs as I wrestled with the creature. It was stronger than anything I'd ever fought, its limbs thrashing like steel cables. I stabbed it again and again, the blade sinking into flesh that felt too cold, too wrong. It slammed me against the wall, my vision blurring from the impact. I thought that was it, that I was done. But Fry came back, wielding a rusted axe he'd found in the corner. He brought it down on the creature's neck, severing its head with a sickening crunch. The body collapsed, twitching, but it didn't get back up. We stumbled out of the cellar, bloody and barely standing. Fry was limping, his face as pale as a ghost. I didn't have the energy to check how bad my injuries were. The sun was rising by the time we made it back to the main road, where a ranger truck was parked. The look on the ranger's face when he saw us covered in blood, carrying our weapons, told me he didn't believe a word of what we told him, but he didn't argue when we led him back to the cabin. The creature's body was still there, just as we'd left it. Later, when the Hups took over, they called it a wild animal attack. They didn't ask too many questions, and neither did we. But I know what I saw. They called it the Ozark Howler. My name is Jack Henry to my friends, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer when the desert was blazing hot, and I was just trying to clear my head. I'd gone through a rough divorce a few months earlier, and I thought some time alone in Anza Borrego Desert State Park would help me get my life back on track. The open sky, the silence, the sense of control over my little RV. I needed that, or so I thought. I pulled into the park on a Friday afternoon. The drive-in had been uneventful, the roads empty, the land stretching out endlessly under a white-hot sun. It was exactly what I wanted, isolation. My RV, newly refurbished after I had spent weeks tinkering with it in my garage, hummed like a dream as I steered it toward a remote camping spot off the main trails. The ranger I checked in with had warned me about the heat and the lack of visitors this time of year, but I waved him off. "I've got plenty of supplies," I said, patting the case of bottled water in the passenger seat. I set up camp near a cluster of jagged rocks with a view of the Borrego Badlands. The air shimmered with heat, but the solitude was intoxicating. I spent the first few hours hiking out to photograph the strange alien landscape. Desert floor cracked like a broken mirror, cacti standing like sentinels against the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, casting the Badlands in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the first stirrings of peace. The first night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, steady rustling, but as I lay there staring at the ceiling of my RV, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My pulse quickened. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The desert was deathly silent, the stars blazing overhead like frozen fireworks. There was no wind, no movement, just me in the sand. I walked a few paces around the RV, scanning the ground, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling lingered that I wasn't alone. The next day I set out early to explore one of the park's famous slot canyons. The heat was already oppressive by mid-morning, my water bottle sweating in my pack as I hiked. I noticed something odd. A lone dead tree stood at the edge of the trail, its branches twisted into unnatural angles. I was sure I hadn't seen it yesterday. Shrugging it off, I continued into the canyon, snapping pictures of the narrow winding walls. But as I climbed out the other side, I saw the tree again, identical, down to the broken limb dangling like a skeletal arm. My stomach tightened. It wasn't possible. By the time I got back to the RV, I was drenched in sweat and shaken. The tree wasn't the only thing along the trail. I'd seen a crumbled rock formation that seemed to follow me, appearing in different places each time I turned a corner. I chalked it up to heat exhaustion and downed a full bottle of water, but the unease lingered. That evening, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the RV. I stayed inside, peering through the curtains, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. "Hello?" I yelled, stepping to the door. "Is someone out there?" The voice didn't answer, but the footsteps stopped. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but sand and rock. I told myself it was an echo, maybe my own voice bouncing off the canyon walls, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something about this place wasn't right. As I packed up, my RV refused to start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Despite the hours I'd spent fine-tuning it, I cursed under my breath, sweat dripping down my face as I tinkered under the hood. By noon, I gave up. The heat was unbearable, my water supply dwindling faster than I'd planned. I checked my phone. No signal. The ranger station was miles away, and the thought of hiking back in this heat made my stomach churn. I decided to stay one more night, hoping the engine trouble was a fluke. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were etched into the ground near my campsite, circles, spirals, and crude arrows scratched into the dirt. I hadn't seen them the night before. Kneeling down, I traced one with my finger. It felt fresh, like someone had drawn it within the last few hours. A chill crept over me despite the heat. That night, I saw him. I was sitting by the fire, trying to focus on my journal instead of the oppressive silence. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of insects and distant coyote calls replaced by a suffocating stillness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood on the ridge above my camp, silhouetted against the starlit sky. At first, I thought it was another camper, but something about the way it moved was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I called, grabbing my flashlight. "Who's there?" The beam caught nothing but empty air. The figure had vanished. The footsteps returned later, louder than ever, circling my RV with an almost mocking rhythm. I sat inside, gripping my pocket knife as objects began to move on their own. My journal flew off the counter, landing open on the floor. The radio crackled to life, spewing static that almost sounded like whispers. Then came the knock, a single deliberate rap on the door. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. I stayed awake all night, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. The next day, I ventured out, desperate to find answers. I retraced my steps to the slot canyon, my eyes scanning the ground for more symbols. That's when I found it, a grave marker hidden among the rocks. It was little more than a weathered stone with a name etched into it. Elias Thatcher, 1886. The symbols I'd seen earlier surrounded it. I stared at the grave, my mind racing. Elias Thatcher, he must have been a pioneer, one of the many who'd passed through these deserts in the 19th century. Had he gotten lost, like I was? Had he died alone out here, wandering endlessly in search of water? I felt the air shift, the temperature dropping despite the blazing sun. Turning, I saw the figure again, closer this time. Its face was shadowed, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. "Elias," I whispered, the name trembling on my lips. "Is that you?" That night, I made an offering. I placed a bottle of water in my journal, filled with sketches and notes about the desert, on the grave. "You're not lost anymore," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "You're found." The desert fell silent, the oppressive heat lifting like a weight from my chest. I didn't see the figure again, but I felt something, like a presence retreating. Finally, at peace, the next morning my RV started without a hitch. As I drove away, the landscape seemed brighter, the air clearer. My GPS and compass, which had been useless the past few days, suddenly worked again. I left Anza Borrego with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The desert holds its secrets tightly, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Even now, I think about Aaliyah's stature, about the footsteps and the symbols, about how close I came to losing myself out there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the desert's gaze watching, waiting.